everyone, welcome to my another video where I'm going to talk about 10 security best practices when dealing with S3 buckets. And if you follow these 10 best practices, I can assure your buckets will be in good shapes. All right, so without further ado, let's start. First thing first, let's talk about bucket permissions. I would like to highlight few things regarding bucket permissions. First of all, make sure you block public access for your buckets, both at account level and at bucket level. And what do I mean by account level and bucket level? Let's see. So in S3 dashboard, there is something called block public access settings for this account in the left navigation bar. So click on here, and here you can see there are 4 things that you can either check or uncheck. Make sure you check all of these 4 options to ensure your buckets within this account will not have any kind of public access. So that's what I mean by block public access at account level. And in that way, we can make sure all the buckets we create will not have any kind of public access. And then I said we also make sure we have to block public access at bucket level as well. And what do I mean by that? If I try to create a bucket and somewhere in the bucket creation page, I can see those options again, and make sure you block all public access while creating the bucket as well. All right. So these are the 2 ways you have to make sure you block any kind of public access for all the buckets. All right. And second thing is, if you want to give access to anyone to your buckets, always try to use bucket policy. And what do I mean by that? If I go to any bucket, there is something called permissions tab. Go there, and in permission tabs, somewhere there is an option to specify the bucket policy. And in the bucket policy, we can specify who can get access to this bucket and at what level. So always try to use bucket policy when it's time to assign some permissions to someone else. And also, I would like to highlight, there is another way we can give access to someone else to our buckets, and that is called access control list. So I would say this is a legacy way to give access to someone to our buckets, and it's always recommended to avoid ACL when it's time to give permissions to some of our buckets. Always use bucket policy when it's time to give some access to someone to our buckets. All right. So that's all about bucket permissions. Now let's talk about our second security best practices when dealing with S3 bucket. And that is, make sure versioning is always enabled for your bucket. You can enable versioning for your buckets when you create them. And also you can enable versioning for your existing bucket as well. So let's see how to enable versioning for your buckets. So if I try to create a bucket, in the bucket creation page, there is an option for versioning, and I always have to make sure the versioning is enabled during the creation of the bucket. I can also enable versioning for existing buckets as well. For example, let's talk about this one. And if I go to Properties tab, I can see versioning is disabled. And if I click Edit, I can enable versioning for this bucket as well. So these are the 2 ways we can enable versionings for our bucket. But there is a caveat, and the caveat is, once you enable versioning for your bucket, you cannot disable it. You can suspend it, but you cannot entirely disable versioning for your buckets. So bear in mind. Number 3, make sure server access logging is always enabled for your buckets. And how can we do that? If I go to any bucket, and if I go to Properties tab, somewhere in the bottom, I can see there is an option called Server Access Logging. Make sure it's enabled. If I click on Edit, I can enable this Server Access Logging. And that's way we can make sure Server Access Logging is enabled for our bucket. Number 4, encryption. Whenever you try to create a bucket, make sure server-side encryption is enabled for your bucket. So if I try to create a bucket, in somewhere in the bucket creation page, I can see an option for enabling encryption. By default, it's disabled, but it's always recommended to have encryption enabled. You can either use the default Amazon S3 managed keys, or you can use AWS KMS to encrypt your bucket. And also, at organization level, you can define a security control policy where we can define if someone tries to create a bucket without having any encryption enabled, that bucket creation request will be denied. So the rule of thumb is make sure buckets are always encrypted, either with default Amazon S3 managed keys or the keys that managed by KMS. Number 5, make sure guard duty is enabled for your account, and guard duty will help us to monitor any kind of suspicious activities within our S3 buckets. For example, requests coming from some unusual geolocation. And how can we enable guard duty? So to enable a guard duty, we have to go to the guard duty page. And if I go to guard duty page, there's an option to enable guard duty. So we can enable guard duty from here as well. All right. After guard duty, also make sure Amazon Messi is enabled for our account. And Amazon Messi will help us to detect any kind of sensitive data within our S3 buckets that might breach data governance security. All right. And to enable Messi, we have to go to the Messi dashboard. And from there, we can enable Messi in just one click. All right. So that's where we can enable Messi for our accounts. Number 7, make sure you enable object lock and MFA delete for your bucket to provide any kind of accidental deletion of data. And let's see how we can enable these two things. To enable object lock, what we can do, we will go to the create bucket page, and somewhere in the bucket creation page, in the advanced settings, we have an option to enable lock for our bucket, right? So this is one way we can enable object lock for our buckets. But remember one thing, we cannot enable object lock once the bucket has been created. Object lock has to be enabled during the creation of bucket, not after the bucket has been created, right? So this is one way we can enable object lock for our bucket. And then let's talk about how we can enable MFA delete for our bucket. Now let's see how we can enable MFA delete for our buckets. So if I go to any of the buckets, and in the properties tab, you can see there's an option for MFA delete. And if I click on edit, I cannot see any way to enable these options. The thing is, so far, we cannot enable MFA delete from the console. It has to be done via either AWS CLI or SDK or APIs. So these are the two things. Always remember, make sure MFA delete is enabled for your bucket, and also make sure object lock is also enabled for your bucket. Number 8, backup your data. Make sure you replicate your data to another secondary region in case there is some outage in the primary region. However, it's very rare, but for safety purposes, always try to keep your data backed up in another secondary region. And how we can do that? Let's try to create a cross-region replication strategy for an existing bucket. So I will go to this bucket, and if I go to management tab, somewhere here we can see an option called replication rules, and from here we can create a rule which will define which buckets we want to be replicated to another secondary region. And that's where we can always have our data backed up in secondary region. Number 9, make sure each of your bucket has event notification enabled. And that way we can ensure all of the objects that are uploaded within a bucket don't contain any kind of virus or malware, right? So make sure event notifications are enabled for each of your bucket. And finally, monitoring. Keep your eyes always open on your buckets. But I know it might be difficult to monitor all the buckets, right? But AWS has an offering for you to monitor your S3 buckets. We can use Security Hub to monitor all the S3 buckets to make sure all of the buckets are compliant. They don't have any kind of security vulnerabilities. So that's all about it. Thank you for watching my videos, and keep subscribing my channel so that you can get notifications for upcoming videos. Bye.